So the topic I'm going to talk to you guys about today is left-handedness. And so the first thing I wanted to ask when I was looking at this is how is the trait that being left-handed, how prevalent is that in the population? And it turns out that about 10 to 12% of people in the world are, like myself, left-handed. With only about 1% being actually truly ambidextrous, meaning they can use both hands equally. And so if 10% of the world is left-handed, how does that parse out when we're looking at our genes? And it turns out that science doesn't really know the answer to that question. There was a study done at Oxford by Dr. William Prandtler who said that potentially there could be hundreds of genes that look at handedness or contribute to whether a person is left-handed or right-handed. But there is some genetic component to it, and surveys of parents and their children prove this. So if I have two right-handed people, they have a 9% chance of having a left-handed baby. If I have a right and a left-handed person, that number jumps to 19%. And if I have two lefties that are having a baby, the chance of their baby also being left-handed jumps to 26%. So you think that there would be some genetic component to whether or not a baby is born right or left-handed. But how did this evolve? So in order to answer that question, we first have to ask ourselves, are other species right-handed? And so I looked at dogs, and it turns out that no, not really. While each individual dog will have a preference for leading with their right or left paw, overall it's about a 50-50 split. So if it's about a 50-50 split in most other animals, including dogs, horses, why would it not be so in humans? So why are there not more left-handed people so that we make up about half of the population? And it turns out that science doesn't really know, but we've got some good theories. In order to understand why we might choose one hand over another, we have to look at how our brain specializes. And this process is called brain lateralization. And it's the theory that as we evolved, our brain took certain tasks and delegated them to certain portions of the brain. In that way, it allowed certain portions of your brain to become specialized. The first person to prove this was a French physician by the name of Paul Broca, who figured out that this area, indicated by the circle, approximately, is called Broca's area and responsible for language and verbal development. And he had this theory that because of this process, because parts of our brain are used for very specific tasks, such as language or fine motor skills, that depending on the wiring of a person's brain, that could either lead them to be left-handed or right-handed. So there is some evidence for this, but it's not as beautifully put as most would like to think. So if you're right-handed, you have a 90% chance of Broca's area being located on the left hemisphere of your brain. And if you're left-handed, you have a 70% chance of Broca's area being located on the left side of your brain. So it's not exactly a complete switch from one side to another. But if that's true, it doesn't really explain the kangaroo. Turns out that most kangaroos, over 90%, are left-handed, which they don't have any specific vocalizations, so this sort of theory of evolution of handedness and language going together doesn't necessarily mean that's the whole picture. And so there's this new theory that's been put out that handed dominance, right, or preferring one hand over another, has now been linked to being bipedal, which just means that you walk on 2 feet. Really, scientists aren't sure why certain people prefer their left or right hand and what the evolutionary mechanism is for left-handedness or right-handedness. But why aren't left-handers gone? Why are we still sticking around even if it's only 10% of the population? Well, scientists have some ideas about why being left-handed could actually be a selective advantage, specifically when fighting against right-handed humans. Left-handers, especially in sports like tennis, boxing, and say if you are doing something a little more deadly like sword fighting, left-handed people have a advantage over right-handed people because most people are right-handed, and so you're used to fighting against right-handed people. 2005, there was a French study that looked at potentially comparing two different types of societies and seeing if there was any difference between the right and left-handed population. And so they looked at one type of society that was focused on cooperation and peace and collaboration, and they found that in that type of society, only 3% of the population was left-handed. But then if you compare that to a warlike, competitive atmosphere in a different type of society, that the percentage of left-handed people jumped to 27%. And so I want to end today by debunking a myth. In 1991, there was a study done at the University of British Columbia that came out with this idea that left-handed people, because we're living in a right-handed world, can't actually live as long as our right-handed counterparts, meaning that we die on average almost 6 years younger than if we had been right-hand dominant. And let's think about this in terms of evolution. If this were true, it seems like that would be such a large selective pressure that we would potentially have died out long ago as a left-handed subgroup of the population. And so numerous studies since then have proven definitively that being left-handed or right-handed does not have anything to do with how long you will live, with the small exception that if you're working with power tools and you're left-handed, you're more likely to get hurt and possibly die. So overall, good news. If you're left-handed like myself, be careful around power tools, but I feel like that's just good advice for everyone.